homeless girl's warning stopped a billionaire's hand and revealed betrayal beyond imagination. Alexander Price carried himself with the calm assurance of a man who had shaped empires. At 52, his name was synonymous with success in Atlanta. Gleaming towers bore his company's logo, charities praised his donations, and reporters trailed his every move. To the cameras, he was a benefactor, a man with deep pockets and deeper kindness. But beneath the polished veneer lay a man hardened by betrayal, one who had seen friendships corrode under envy and loyalty crumble when tested by greed. The midday sun pressed down mercilessly as Alexander stepped out of the towering glass and marble corporate headquarters. The conference inside had been a performance of applause and flashing cameras, but outside the world was sweltering and real. Heat shimmered above the pavement, horns blared from congested streets, and the scent of asphalt mixed with exhaust. On the curb, a silver car awaited, sleek, spotless, and gleaming as though it had absorbed the sun's brilliance. Its metallic surface reflected every detail of the bustling avenue, the blur of pedestrians, the quick movements of journalists packing their gear, the imposing shadows of skyscrapers. A uniformed chauffeur moved briskly to open the rear door, bowing slightly. Alexander adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, the fabric catching faint glimmers in the sunlight, and began his descent down the marble steps that radiated heat like burning stone. Around him, people slowed their steps just to look at him, some whispering, others pulling out phones for a fleeting photo. The air carried admiration, envy, and the kind of awe reserved for men who seemed untouchable. Yet amidst the scattered crowd, one figure moved differently. She emerged as though from nowhere, small, hunched, nearly swallowed by the oversized backpack slung across her shoulders. Leah, a girl no older than 20, skin dulled by dust, hair unkempt, clothes faded and frayed. She stumbled forward from the sidewalk's edge, barefoot on the hot concrete, her frame trembling under the weight of her own urgency. At first, no one paid her much attention. In a city where wealth and struggle brushed shoulders every day, a homeless girl darting through the crowd seemed almost ordinary. But her eyes, wide, wild, and burning with terror, fixed themselves on Alexander. And her voice, raw and jagged, cut through the hum of traffic and chatter with shocking force. "Don't drive!" she screamed, clutching the straps of her torn backpack as if it anchored her to the earth. Your friend cut the brake lines. For a second, silence swallowed the street. Conversation stalled. The chauffeur froze, his hand on the door handle. Reporters turned sharply, their cameras pivoting. Passers-by blinked in disbelief, some scoffing, others laughing at the absurdity. Alexander stopped mid-step, the polished marble gleaming beneath his shoes. His gaze, calm yet faintly clouded, fell upon the trembling girl. In her desperation, she looked both fragile and fierce, as though the weight of the truth she carried might shatter her or everyone around her. Around them, the city pulsed with heat and noise, but in that moment, Alexander felt the world narrow to a single question. How could this ragged stranger know anything about him or his car? Stephen Harrington appeared at Alexander's side just as Leah's cry rippled across the street. Tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculately groomed in a tailored gray suit, he was the kind of man who wore power like a second skin. His cufflinks glinted as he adjusted his jacket, and then, without missing a beat, he laughed. The sound was sharp, derisive, and it carried easily over the stunned silence. "Alexander," he said, his voice smooth, confident, but edged with ridicule. "Are you really going to let this vagrant stop you from going about your day?" He flicked his wrist in Leah's direction as though brushing away an insect. "Brake lines? She's clearly delusional. God knows what kind of substances she's on." A ripple of laughter followed. First from a few men in suits lingering on the steps, then from a cluster of passers-by who had stopped to watch. Even a woman with a stroller smirked, shaking her head as if Leah were nothing more than a scene of cheap street theater. Leah's thin shoulders heaved, but she did not retreat. Her bare feet pressed firmly against the burning concrete, her torn backpack slipping halfway down her arm as she shouted again. "I saw him. I saw him under the car. Tools in his hand. I swear it. I swear on my life." Her voice cracked, but her eyes never wavered. The chauffeur frowned, glancing between Alexander and Stephen. One of the security guards stepped forward, reaching as if to pull Leah away, but she jerked back, desperation fueling her fragile body. Alexander remained rooted in place. His heart thudded heavily, though his face betrayed only the faintest trace of unease. Stephen had been by his side for 30 years. College days, the first business ventures, the rise of their empire. They had weathered storms together, celebrated victories, mourned losses. Trust like that was not built overnight, nor broken by the words of a stranger. And yet, Alexander studied Leah. She was trembling, yes, but there was no mistaking the clarity in her eyes. They were not glazed or vacant like someone intoxicated. They were sharp, insistent, and terrified. The raw conviction in her voice scraped against the smooth confidence of Stephen's dismissal. Stephen clapped Alexander on the shoulder, his laugh rolling easily once more. "Come now, old friend. Don't let this nonsense rattle you. She probably saw a mechanic doing a routine check earlier and invented a story." He leaned closer, lowering his tone just enough for Alexander to hear. "People like her will do anything for attention. Or a handout." The words slid into Alexander's ear with practiced familiarity, yet they carried a weight he couldn't quite ignore. Something in Stephen's eyes, too sharp, too quick, sent a faint chill down his spine. Leah dropped to her knees suddenly, palms slapping against the pavement. Tears streaked down her dusty cheeks, cutting trails through grime. "Please," she begged, her voice ragged. "Don't trust him. I know I look like nothing, I know I'm dirty, I know I'm nobody, but I saw what I saw." The crowd erupted again, jeers spilling like venom. "Crazy girl! Someone lock her up!" "Pathetic!" Every word stung Alexander, though none were directed at him. The injustice of it all pressed heavily on his chest. Leah's appearance, her tangled hair, her thin arms, the dirt caked on her legs, had already condemned her in the court of public opinion. Not a soul cared about her words, only the spectacle she created. But Alexander did care, or at least he wanted to. He glanced at the car gleaming under the sun, so pristine it looked untouched by human hands. Could Stephen, his friend, his brother in everything but blood, truly have stooped so low? The very thought felt poisonous, and yet the image of Leah's blazing eyes would not leave him. Stephen's voice rang out again, louder, directed toward the onlookers. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's be reasonable. Are we really entertaining the hysterics of a homeless girl who probably hasn't eaten in days?" He chuckled darkly, adjusting his tie. "If you ask me, this is nothing more than a sad little performance." The crowd laughed with him now, emboldened by his certainty. Leah's small frame seemed to shrink beneath their mockery, yet her voice rose again, defiant through her tears. "I saw him. I saw him under your car. Don't drive it! You'll die if you do!" Her words sliced through Alexander like a blade. The noise of the crowd blurred at the edges of his hearing. He could almost see it. Stephen crouched beneath the silver frame of his car, hand steady on a wrench, jaw clenched in quiet betrayal. But was it truth or madness? The marble steps behind him radiated heat, the air thick with exhaust and judgment. Alexander felt the weight of expectation pressing down, the crowd waiting for him to scoff and dismiss the girl like everyone else. His chauffeur still stood at the car, uncertain. Stephen's smile grew thinner, sharper, and Leah, ragged and desperate, knelt at his feet with nothing but her words as armor. For the first time in years, Alexander Price, a man who commanded boardrooms and swayed nations with his wealth, found himself caught in a battle he could not buy his way out of. Trust a stranger who looked like she had nothing to lose, or place his life in the hands of the friend who had everything to gain. The sun hammered down, a white-hot coin in the sky, and its light pounded off the chrome of the silver luxury car until it seemed to sizzle. Heat waves rose in thin mirages from the asphalt. Cicadas droned in the trees like a persistent, indifferent audience. Alexander felt the glare in his eyes even with his gaze level, and for a moment the whole scene, the marble tower, the polished vehicle, the cluster of onlookers, blurred into a bright, humming background. He was a man used to surfaces, shiny facades that hid complex mechanisms, smooth statements that masked messy motives. Today, a faint, sinister sheen on the ground carved across the gloss. Leah's finger jabbed toward the car with the insistence of someone who had anchored herself to certainty. "That's brake fluid."
"Look closer!"
Her voice, raw from shouting, ricocheted off glass and steel. The syllables hung in the air like an accusation. Alexander's chauffeur, whose hand still rested on the open door, narrowed his eyes and glanced down. It took a second for anyone else to see it. A thin, oily trail seeping from beneath the vehicle. A dark line on the sun-bright pavement that didn't belong to rain or spilled soda. It gathered small, iridescent beads at its edge. The chemical scent, sharp, metallic, like a hospital and a garage at once, rose up and mixed with the hotter, fainter smell of burning rubber and asphalt. For the first time that afternoon, Alexander felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. Stephen's laughter broke like glass. "This is absurd," he snapped, the sharp angles of his voice cutting through the murmur. He stepped forward as if to close the distance, his hand lifted in a dismissive wave. "Don't waste your time on her lies." There was an edge to him now, a briskness that didn't belong to the easy camaraderie of earlier years. The smirk he wore was practiced. Behind it, something taut and fast as a wire glinted. The crowd's mood shifted like wind on water, ripples of reaction, some small waves. A few faces showed worry. Most wore the smirk of entertainment. It was easier, always easier, to laugh at a spectacle than to face a real threat. Someone clicked their phone camera with bored curiosity. A teenager nudged his friend and mimed the girl's pleading. A woman folding her grocery list frowned with annoyance that the interruption might delay her afternoon. Social judgment landed on Leah like a flinging of stones. She was dirty, barefoot, hair tangled by the breeze. Her clothes carried the faint geometry of neglect. That alone, the crowd seemed to say without words, disqualified her truth. Leah's voice fractured at the edges. Sweat made a dark patch at the base of her throat despite the thinness of her clothes. She drew a rattling breath and fixed her eyes on Alexander with a fierceness that had nothing to do with pride, more like a last ember refusing to die out. "Please," she said, the words small but steady. "You'll die if you drive that car." The chauffeur shifted his weight uneasily. The security detail, trained to be guardians of image, of seamless exits and curated moments, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of uncertainty. One of them rubbed his jaw and glanced toward the group of men in suits who had been waiting for Alexander. Another looked at the car as if seeing it fresh for the first time, its lines, its hubcaps, the clean sweep of its skirt. The metallic scent seemed to gain a presence, tugging at the edges of everyone's attention. Alexander crouched, an old motion born of a lifetime of inspections and site visits. He was careful in his movement, no dramatics, no gesture meant for approval, just the simple act of looking. The asphalt warmed the back of his hands through the tail of his suit coat. Up close, the trail shimmered with a fragile, oily rainbow. He could see tiny beads gathering into the darker edge where the fluid met pavement, and he smelled it again, clearer, chemical and slightly sweet, unmistakable once named. Doubt, which had been a quiet guest until then, pulled a chair forward and sat. Stephen stepped in a half-inch closer, the air between his shoulders and Alexander's prickling with old intimacy and new strain. "Alex," he said, low enough that only Alexander could hear, "think this through. This woman—" He broke off, eyes flicking past Leah to the edges of the crowd, searching perhaps for validation. "People like her make scenes. Let us handle this. The thing about a lifetime of shared deals and late-night strategies is that it lends a voice to suspicion that is nearly indistinguishable from loyalty." Alexander could hear Stephen's cadence and recognize it, his friend's authority, the comfortable belief that together they had carried storms and would carry them still. But beneath that cadence came a new rhythm, an urgency hardly masked by benevolence. Stephen's jaw tightened in a way that suggested argument not on principle, but on something more personal. Leah's knuckles were white around the strap of her backpack. Her legs trembled as she stood, not just from the heat. Her whole body had that quiver that comes from bearing witness to something unbearable. She remembered details that gave her the edge of conviction. The way a cuff had glinted, the way a sleeve had brushed the gravel, the metallic bend of a hand that tightened a tool. She tried to put those images into words, to turn them into a proof that would pierce the social armor around the men in suits. "Please," she repeated, louder, forcing her plea through the clumsy lattice of public scorn. I saw him with tools. Under your car. He was the one who did it. No one moved to corroborate. The air filled with small noises, a stroller wheel squeaking, a taxi bell in the distance, a clerk's radio murmuring. Yet these were background to the pounding of Alexander's chest, the tightening of his palms. He felt the weight of a choice spreading across his shoulders like a cloak, partly his, partly placed there by the crowd's expectations and Stephen's easy dominance. The car gleamed between them, mute and beautiful and suddenly dangerous. Alexander's hand hovered near the door handle, on the edge of a decision that could not be taken back. Around him the city glowed in heat and impatience, and Leah, barefoot and trembling, held a truth no one wanted to accept. He could feel both paths before him, the smooth, well-worn road of trusting the man he had called comrade, or the ragged, unlikely path of listening to a stranger who might yet save his life. For a man who had always measured risk with spreadsheets and contingency plans, this calculation had no tidy columns. The sunlight on chrome, the smell of chemical and asphalt, Leah's desperate face, all of it braided into a moment that would not be easily dismissed. The air seemed to thicken, as if even the sweltering Georgia sun had paused to witness what came next. Alexander's jaw tightened, his hand curling into a fist at his side. For decades, he had been known as a man of swift decisions, commanding boardrooms, commanding markets, commanding men. But now, his authority was being tested on the marble steps of his own empire. Under the eyes of strangers and vultures alike, his gaze shifted between Leah, trembling but unyielding, and Stephen, the man who had been at his side since their first shaky startup, the man who toasted with him at every success, who clasped his shoulder when things seemed impossible. Betrayal had never been a language Alexander thought he would hear from Stephen's lips. But the faint drip beneath the car gleamed like blood on white linen. And Leah's words gnawed at him, refusing to let go. Enough, Alexander said finally, his voice low, carrying more weight than a shout. The crowd stilled instantly. Even Stephen faltered at the tone, though his sneer quickly returned. Alexander gestured to the silver car, polished to a mirror-like shine under the noon sun. Get someone to check it, now. The command cracked through the air like thunder. Stephen's composure shattered. His face flushed red, his voice pitched high with indignation. You can't be serious, Alex. You're letting some filthy street rat dictate your judgment? Do you know how insane this looks? You'll humiliate yourself! His words spat venom, each syllable dripping with outrage. But beneath the fury, his eyes darted, nervous. Frantic, a security guard, uncertain but obedient, hurried toward the parking area and returned with a man in grease-stained overalls, clearly dragged straight from beneath another vehicle. The mechanic wiped his hands with a rag, squinting against the sun as the crowd parted for him. His expression carried that rare blend of curiosity and apprehension, someone aware that he was about to walk into a storm larger than himself. Stephen barked, "This is absurd. He doesn't need to—" Quiet. Alexander's voice sliced through Stephen's protest, cold, unwavering, the kind of tone that had silenced whole conference rooms. The mechanic knelt, sliding onto his back, his tools clinking softly. The asphalt radiated heat, shimmering waves rising from its black surface. Cicadas whined in the still air, their unrelenting chorus the only sound as the man disappeared under the gleaming car. The crowd leaned forward unconsciously, breaths held, eyes wide. Seconds dragged like hours. Leah's small hands clenched the straps of her torn backpack, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she stared at the car, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Alexander stood rigid, his eyes fixed on the mechanic's boots protruding from beneath the car. And Stephen paced like a cornered animal, his curses growing more fractured, his eyes darting to every face that watched him. Finally, with a sharp scrape, the mechanic slid out. His skin was pale beneath the grime, his eyes wide as if he had seen a ghost crouching in the shadows. His hand trembled as he held up a stained rag, streaked with a dark fluid. "She's right," he said, his voice breaking with urgency. "The brake lines, they've been cut clean. If you'd driven this car, you wouldn't have made it to the end of the block." Gasps tore through the crowd like a wave. Some covered their mouths, others instinctively turned toward Leah, the girl they had mocked only minutes before. Her frail figure now stood taller, vindicated in the truth that dripped beneath that silver car. Alexander's chest rose sharply as he straightened, his suit catching the sun. His eyes locked on Stephen. There was no anger in them now, only a deep, hollow disappointment. It was a gaze that stripped away every pretense, every excuse. Stephen froze, his bravado crumbling like ash. For one suspended moment, silence reigned. Then, as if surrendering to the inevitable, his lips curled into a snarl. "You were never meant to make it out alive today," he hissed, his voice low and venomous, yet echoing loud enough for all to hear. The words struck like a hammer. The betrayal, no longer veiled, bled openly into the sweltering summer air. The weight of decades, their victories, their losses, their brotherhood, turned to dust in an instant. Alexander's security guards surged forward, seizing Stephen by the arms. He struggled, thrashing like a trapped wolf, but the fight only underscored his guilt. The crowd recoiled, whispers spilling between them, faces painted with shock and disgust. Leah's shoulders sagged with relief, tears brimming in her eyes. For the first time in years, someone had heard her, believed her, and the truth had saved a life. Alexander didn't move as Stephen was dragged away. He stood tall against the blazing sun, his tailored suit immaculate, but his heart heavy, carved hollow by betrayal. The marble steps beneath his feet felt colder now, less like triumph, more like a warning etched into stone. The cicadas hummed louder, as if filling the silence Stephen's words left behind. And in the midst of it all, Alexander turned, not to the crowd, not to the cameras, but to the trembling girl whose courage had cut through lies sharper than any blade. Her presence was small, but her truth had been mighty, and Alexander Price, billionaire, survivor, and betrayed friend, knew he would never forget the sound of her voice that day. For a moment no one moved. The echoes of Stephen's venomous confession still hung in the air, pressing down on the crowd with an invisible weight. The guards dragged him away, his curses fading into the distance until only the hum of cicadas and the muffled sound of traffic filled the silence. Then Leah's small frame trembled violently. The weight of adrenaline, fear, and vindication all crashed down at once. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the hot marble steps, her backpack slipping from her shoulder and landing with a dull thud. Dust billowed around her, clinging to her sweat-damp skin, streaking the tears that poured freely down her cheeks. The same crowd that had laughed and jeered at her only minutes earlier now stood frozen in stunned silence. Their mocking smiles had evaporated. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Businessmen loosened their ties nervously, and whispers rippled through the assembly. But no one dared speak to her. No one dared reach for her. Not yet. All eyes shifted to Alexander. The billionaire's face was unreadable, his expression caught between steel and sorrow. His steps were measured as he turned from the silver car and walked toward the girl. Each stride carried the weight of decades of trust broken, of mortality revealed. His polished leather shoes splashed through the dark puddle of brake fluid that had gathered beneath the car, staining their perfection. The sound of liquid rippling underfoot echoed in the still air like a grim reminder of how close death had lingered. When he reached her, the world seemed to hold its breath. Alexander Price, who had built skyscrapers, commanded armies of suits, and stood unbent before the world's harshest critics, lowered himself onto one knee beside the homeless girl who had saved his life. Gasps rippled through the crowd. To see a man of his stature kneeling on dirty marble, his expensive trousers brushing against the dusty ground, was an image no one would forget. His voice, when it came, was softer than anyone expected. Stripped of authority, stripped of the armor he wore in public. It was the voice of a man who had nearly lost everything. "You saved me." He paused, the words trembling with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. His hand hovered as if afraid to touch her, as if unworthy. "And no one believed you," Leah's lips quivered. She blinked, tears cutting rivers down the dust smeared across her young face. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, exhaustion pulling at every inch of her fragile body. Slowly she lifted her eyes to his. They were dark and weary, but burning with a truth that no laughter or mockery could extinguish. "I didn't want to watch another good man die," she whispered. Her voice cracked, barely audible, but it sliced through the air sharper than Stephen's betrayal. Alexander's chest tightened. For years he had built walls around his heart, guarding it from betrayal and false flattery, hiding his weariness behind a polished smile. Yet here was a girl who had nothing, no home, no family, no safety net. And still, she had risked everything to warn him. Her words were not about wealth or power. They were about life, about the fragility of goodness in a world that had taken too much from her already. A hush settled deeper over the crowd. For once, the city's noise seemed to fade, the honking cars, the endless chatter, even the cicadas, all softened, as if bowing to the gravity of the moment. Alexander reached out, this time steady, and brushed away a streak of dust and tears from Leah's cheek. His touch was gentle, uncharacteristic for a man whose life had been ruled by firm handshakes and sharp signatures. The sight stunned those watching, as though the billionaire himself had transformed before their eyes. Behind them, some in the crowd lowered their heads in shame. They remembered their laughter, their cruel words, the way they had dismissed her with disdain. And now, confronted with the truth, they were forced to reckon with the ugliness of their own doubt. Alexander's voice carried again, firm but tender for all to hear. "This girl saved my life while all of us ignored her. We saw rags and dirt, but she saw what no one else would. She had the courage to speak when every one of us chose silence." Leah's body shuddered as another wave of tears spilled. She pressed her palms against the stone steps, grounding herself in the heat of the marble, as though she might fade if she didn't cling to something real. Yet in that moment, despite her exhaustion, a faint flicker of pride lit her features. Alexander lowered his head closer, his voice now meant for her alone. "You deserve far more than the world has given you." Leah swallowed hard. Her voice, broken but sincere, rasped again. "I just didn't want to lose another good man." The words echoed, carried by the silence of the crowd. They pierced Alexander deeper than any betrayal, heavier than any fortune he had ever earned. For the first time in years, Alexander Price felt something shift inside him. Not the rush of victory, not the weight of wealth, but the sting of humility. On those marble steps, under the scorching Atlanta sun, kneeling in brake fluid and dust, he realized that salvation had come not from the empire he had built, but from a girl no one had believed. And as the crowd looked on, their billionaire knelt beside the forgotten. Their mocking turned to awe, their silence now carved with shame. Stephen's protests turned into guttural shouts as the guards dragged him toward the waiting black SUV at the curb. His voice cracked, his once commanding tone reduced to a feral growl. "You'll regret this, Alexander. You'll regret it." The crowd flinched at his fury, but Alexander didn't so much as glance his way. Stephen's power had dissolved into dust. His betrayal had stripped him of every ounce of dignity. The heavy doors slammed shut, and the SUV pulled away. The noise of its engine dwindled, leaving only the cicadas and the restless shuffle of shoes among the spectators. For the first time in hours, the air seemed to shift. The scorching sun that had burned relentlessly all afternoon eased behind a drifting veil of clouds, softening the heat. A faint breeze carried through the street, stirring coats and skirts as if the city itself exhaled in relief. Alexander remained kneeling by Leah's side. His hand lingered just above her shoulder, careful not to startle her, careful not to patronize. For a man who had signed away millions with the flick of a pen, this hesitation revealed more about his heart than any press conference ever had. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. "Enough of this." He reached out and clasped Leah's trembling hands, pulling her gently up from the marble steps. Her legs wobbled, her small frame swaying as though she might crumble again, but his grip was firm, steadying her. The crowd gasped softly at the sight. Alexander Price, billionaire titan of steel and glass, lifting a homeless girl as if she were the most important person in the world. Leah blinked rapidly, her lashes sticky with tears and grime. For a moment she seemed dazed, unmoored, as though she still couldn't quite believe the danger had passed. But then she saw the steadiness in his eyes, blue, sharp, but softened now by something rare, gratitude unmasked. "You don't belong on the streets," Alexander said, his voice carrying not just to her but to everyone gathered. "Not after this. Not after today." Her lips parted, a protest caught in her throat. I don't need charity," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He shook his head, cutting her words short. "No, not charity." He drew a breath, his gaze locking onto hers, every syllable deliberate. "A chance. A life with dignity. You deserve more than rags and suspicion. You deserve to be seen, Leah." The name lingered in the air, spoken with a reverence no one had ever given her before. Leah's chest constricted, tears welling anew. For so long she had been invisible. Just another face people avoided on sidewalks. Just another body dismissed in the shadows. Now, in the center of a crowd that once mocked her, she stood not as an outcast, but as a savior. A murmur rose among the onlookers. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier cruelty. Others whispered to one another, struggling to reconcile the scene before them. A few even lifted their phones, snapping photos, not of Alexander as they once would have, but of the girl beside him. Alexander glanced at the crowd, then back to Leah. "You'll have shelter tonight, food, but more than that. I'll make sure you have a future, not as a beggar, not as a forgotten soul, but as someone valued." The promise hung in the humid air, heavy with conviction. Leah's breath shuddered. For years, promises had been lies that melted into nothing, words tossed like scraps. But this carried weight. This came from a man who had everything yet knelt before her, brake fluid still staining his shoes. Her voice wavered as she whispered, "Why me?" "Because you had the courage," Alexander answered, his hand resting lightly against her shoulder. "When everyone else laughed, when even I doubted, you stood. Truth came from your lips when no one wanted to hear it. That courage deserves more than silence." Leah swallowed hard, her gaze darting to the crowd. Dozens of eyes watched, wide and unblinking, as though awaiting her next word. She had never stood in the center before, never been the voice people wanted to hear. Her chest rose as she inhaled deeply, grounding herself. For the first time in years, she felt her spine straighten, her shoulders lift. Dust and rags still clung to her, but dignity wrapped itself around her like new clothing. The marble steps gleamed softly now under the muted afternoon light. The sun, once merciless, had turned gentle behind drifting clouds, casting the two figures in a diffused glow. Alexander Price, in his tailored suit, now stained with dirt and oil, stood beside Leah, barefoot and worn, yet radiant in the truth she had carried. Side by side, their silhouettes stretched long across the pavement, merging into one as if fate itself had bound them together. The image burned into the memory of everyone present, a billionaire and a homeless girl, equals in the light of survival and truth. And as the city pulsed around them, the moral settled over the crowd like scripture. Truth and courage can come from the most overlooked souls. Never dismiss a warning because of the messenger's appearance, for sometimes salvation wears rags, not riches.